All right, Alexander. So it looks like Joe Biden has decided to have a conversation now with the man that he dubbed a killer, which is Russian President Vladimir Putin. And they did have, from what the reports are, they had a pretty long conversation. They touched upon a lot of topics. Take us into that talk between Biden and Putin. Take us into some of what they have decided. Tentatively, they've decided to perhaps have a meeting, and now I'm getting news that maybe it might be in Vienna, Austria, or at least Austria is offering their services for the meeting. I don't think that Biden could travel that far a distance. Maybe the most he could do a meeting at is, I don't know, maybe Bethesda, Maryland, or Fairfax, Virginia. Maybe he can make it there, but I don't think he can make it all the way to Austria. Anyway, Alexander, get into this phone conversation. We have some breaking news here as well with this conversation from the Kremlin, from the White House. What's going on here?
I mean, it's been an interesting conversation because apparently it was the Russians weren't expecting it. It came out of nowhere. Biden suddenly telephoned Putin. Putin picked up the phone. They spoke for apparently a long time, around an hour. Some reports say, some reports say even longer. One wonders how that went. But it's important to say, first of all, that absolutely nothing was agreed about anything. And that's the single most important fact about it. I mean, there was no agreement on anything. Biden proposed a summit meeting. The Russians tentatively said yes, but it's not yet been agreed that there will be a summit meeting. There's no agreement about the venue, though the Russians are keen on Vienna, as you said. Helsinki is apparently being ruled out because from Biden's point of view, he doesn't want to go to Helsinki because that's where Trump met Putin. And as you correctly say, it might be too far away. There's also talk about Iceland. Iceland, of course, is much closer to the United States. I think the Russians will have issues with Iceland, because Gorbachev met Reagan there, and it's felt in Russia by some people that wasn't a success for Russia at the time. So the Russians are keen on Vienna. We'll see whether it even happens at all. Now, what they talked about was apparently many things, and Biden apparently told Putin that he wants relations with Russia to become stable and predictable. Now, it's so interesting because just a few days ago, a week ago, he was calling Putin a killer, just as you said. We were getting all that talk from the United States that there was going to be a big cyber attack on Russia. Remember that? There was going to be the big cyber attack on Russia. There was all the talk about the punishment of Russia, the sanctions on Russia, the attempts to block Nord Stream 2. And now suddenly, out of the blue, Biden telephones Putin, and there's this, apparently amiable call in which they talk about lots of things. They talk about Libya, they talk about Syria, they talk about Afghanistan, they talk about Iran, they talk about having arms control, New Start, building on New Start, seeking a stable and predictable relationship between the two countries, ironing out all their problems. They didn't talk about Navalny. Now, that is really remarkable because up to now and for the last few weeks, every single Western leader who's spoken to Putin has brought up Navalny. I mean, it's a regular issue that gets touched on. You see it in every readout of every conversation. But, Navalny suddenly, from being the most important man in the world, suddenly becomes a man of no importance, so little importance that we don't even mention him. So what is going on? Why did Biden telephone Putin at this time? Well, I've done a big analysis, a real tough breakdown of this call on my own channel, which should be coming up soon. I think it's related ultimately to the situation in Ukraine. And what's happened is the Russians have built up very big forces around Ukraine, really huge forces, in fact. And the Ukrainians now find themselves in a situation where they got their army on the border, but if they attack, they will be crushed. The Europeans are in a panic. The US military has just announced that its fleet that was going to go to the Black Sea isn't going to go to the Black Sea after all, because the Russians have said that if it does, well, it won't be welcome there. And I think what the US is trying to do is it's trying to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine in some form without losing face. So the way you do it is you come along, you talk to Putin, you ask for a de-escalation of the situation in Ukraine, you talk about Ukraine, you look for a way to call the troops back, but you try to avoid appearing to retreat by burying the discussion in a vast mass of other issues. So you also talk about Afghanistan, about Syria, about Libya, about arms control, about all sorts of other things, and bury Ukraine amongst this mass of other topics. So in a way, it's a diversion. But I think it is the Ukrainian situation, where, as I said, where there's this big assemblage of Russian troops that is probably what's driving the whole thing and explains this call. That's my view anyway. Now, as I said, it could very well be that when this immediate crisis in Ukraine is overcome, we're going to go back to the old, the old gramophone record, Putin a killer, but unacceptable things, Russians meddling again, and all of that. But it's increasingly looking to me like the Biden administration, or rather the Biden-Harris administration. It talks very tough, but when it comes to it, when they really find themselves up against a real adversary, they pull back. And that's how I interpret this call. Mm-hmm.
Well, two things that I have to say about this. Number one, we were right when we did the shows about the Stephanopoulos Biden interview. We said it was 100% scripted, 100% for domestic consumption. It was a stupid idea because it's going to piss off the Russians and it's going to make the U.S. look absolutely ridiculous on the international stage, which it did. But the script writers, who are probably a bunch of Twitter, SJW, Hollywood type of people that are sitting in some room in LA or New York, and they scripted this out, didn't think in geopolitical terms. They thought about creating a show, and that's what it was. Tough guy Biden calling the evil Putin a killer. That's what they thought of as they were, scripting this out and putting up their storyboards. So it was purely for domestic consumption. It was, just pure scripted Hollywood theatrics, and that's what it was for. But it did a lot of damage. Of course, the script writers in DC, the script writers in LA and New York, that's where I think they're located. They didn't think along those lines. Obviously, it's not the first time. It won't be the last time they do these stupid things. But anyway, that's the first thing. You can comment on that. The second thing, though, is, and this is, let me see how I can phrase this. Why would the Biden administration, I agree, it's all about Ukraine, this call. Why would the Biden administration talk with the Russian government, with the Kremlin, in order to figure out ways to get out of this Ukraine mess, when we know for a fact that Ukraine doesn't make any moves, zero moves, without the authorization, the consent of the United States, maybe the Pentagon, maybe the State Department, maybe the White House, I don't know, maybe all three. But we know that foreign policy, even domestic policy, foreign policy, definitely stuff that is connected with the east of Ukraine, with the Donbass. We know that Zelensky wouldn't dare do anything. He wouldn't move one tank. He wouldn't move one soldier to that border if he didn't get the consent of somebody in DC. So does this kind of hint at the fact that maybe Ukraine and Zelensky are getting orders from one side of the White House and the Biden, one side of the government, and the Biden White House is kind of saying, wait a minute, who authorized Zelensky to move troops there? I don't know. I'm spitballing stuff out. But to me, it sounds like for them to call up Putin and to essentially embarrass themselves and grovel, which is what they're doing, in order to find a way out of this mess that they created, I'm saying the Biden administration, it means that something is not right there. Do you understand what I mean? There's no way that Zelensky would have done this if he didn't have the authorization from the U.S. government. So why is Biden now trying to find a way out of this?
I absolutely agree with that. I think that analysis, by the way, is spot on. Now, let's go back a few weeks. I mean, it was Ukraine that moved its troops at the beginning of March to the border with, to the ceasefire line. They would not have done that without a green light from Washington. And we know, because the Turks have told us, that it was around the same time that the US asked Turkey for permission to send these 2 destroyers into the Black Sea. Now, the US is saying, by the way, that those destroyers were never intended to go to the Black Sea. So either the Turks are lying or the US has suddenly changed its mind and is, lying instead. Well, on this one, I believe the Turks. Why would they lie about something like this? So somebody gave the green light to Zelensky to move the troops east. Somebody decided to support Zelensky in doing that by sending the US Navy to the Black Sea. What they were actually thinking they would achieve by doing that, I am not sure. Whether there was a serious attempt to launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine and a real calculation that maybe the Russians would stand back and allow the Donbass to be reoccupied, I don't know. Whether it was hardliners, neocon hardliners in Washington who were eager for a confrontation with Russia and saw it all as a good way, perhaps, of wrecking Nord Stream 2 and something like that. Well, maybe it was. Maybe there was some big plan. In fact, it looks to me as if probably there was a plan. And then what happened was a number of things started to happen all at the same time. Firstly, the Russians reacted on a far bigger scale than anybody in the US expected. I mean, we have information from the Russians now about the extent of the build-up in on the Ukrainian border. We are talking about 2 army groups, 3 airborne divisions, ballistic missiles. I mean, this is a force of around 100,000 men, backed by aviation. I mean, it would obliterate Ukraine. It could be in Kiev probably within days. Now, that is creating a panic because, of course, the destruction of Ukraine in that way would be a disaster politically for the US. So they have to pull back. Now, if they pull back all those troops from the ceasefire line, the problem is not going to be so much in Washington. It will be to some extent in Europe because the Germans and the French are very alarmed by all of this and they're starting to question what's going on. But the problem will be in Ukraine itself because Zelensky has been passing all these decrees recently talking about how Ukraine is going to end the occupation of Crimea, end the occupation of the Donbass. He moved all those troops to eastern Ukraine. He's becoming under enormous pressure from the hardline ultra-nationalists that, populate the leadership in Ukraine. And if he now pulls back in that way, he will be humiliated. He will lose massive face. And frankly, his position, which is already becoming very precarious, could start to look threatened. So they've got to find a way of pulling all those troops back and at the same time not humiliating Zelensky. So they got themselves, the neocon faction, if you like, have got everybody into a complete mess. If Ukraine advances, it could very easily be destroyed. If Ukraine retreats, Zelensky could be humiliated and might even fall, in which case Ukraine is destabilized. So they've got to find a way of patching things up, of retreating, and of avoiding this debacle that is now that they're now facing. And that means talking to the Russians, trying to find some face-saving way to do it, and as I said, burying it all in a lot of talk about Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, arms control, all the rest. And that's what I think this agenda is. And it's exactly what you said. Now, we have an expression in Britain. We talk about joined up government. We talked about a government where all the pieces know what the other pieces are doing, where there's a sort of everything moves together as one towards a certain purpose. We don't have that in the United States because we have a very weak president at the centre who everybody knows is not on top of his brief. And you have various different factions in the bureaucracy who are doing what they want to do. We have people, I suspect, in the National Security Council and the State Department who want to carry out, and the CIA, who want to pursue neocon policies in Ukraine. We have the Pentagon, the uniformed military in Ukraine, who are looking at all of this with total horror. We have those people who say, well, actually, we should focus on China instead. And we have a president who doesn't know how to make decisions. So suddenly they found out in the White House that all of this was going on. They probably were getting all these urgent calls from the Europeans telling them, for God's sake, bring this thing to an end fast because we're looking at a debacle. And so the result is you wheel out Sleepy Joe, you get him to call Putin out of the blue without any kind of preparation, without any kind of forewarning, and you say to him, please, de-escalate. And at the same time, if we do that, we'll have a nice summit. We'll talk about all of these other things that you're so concerned about, arms control, strategic stability, and all the rest. I just wanted to touch on the point that you made right at the beginning of the call about that comment about Putin is a killer. You're absolutely right. It was a complete narrative construction. They, again, completely underestimated the Russian reaction. The Russians were furious about it. They recalled their ambassador, and you, as someone who comes from a diplomatic family, knows what a big statement that is. And over the last few days, right up to just a few hours before this call took place, the Russians were saying publicly that their ambassador would not be sent back to Washington until and unless Washington changed its policies and started to talk to the Russians in a more respectful and constructive way. So that was a massive blunder, all done to shape a narrative in the United States. And again, the consequences of that, like the consequences of sending the Ukrainian army all the way to the contact line, were not thought through. This is turning out to be the most disorganized and incompetent administration with respect to foreign policy that I can remember.
Right. I just want to be clear here. I want to be very, 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 very clear as to what I'm going to say here. This story is not really about Ukraine. This story is about the disarray and the dysfunction of the United States government and its foreign policy, is it not? Because to make it very simple, I'll give a very simple hypothetical, 100% hypothetical situation as how this might have gone down. Maybe the Pentagon called the military in Ukraine and Zelensky and, the top brass in Ukraine. They said, look, we want you guys to move troops to the border and want you guys to start up the conflict with Russia again. Zelensky said, I guess if it's coming from the Pentagon, it must be, an order from Biden as well, from the president as well. So yeah, I'll do as you say. So he starts moving everything over. And then the Biden White House gets wind of this and they say, what the hell's going on? Who ordered this? The Pentagon's doing whatever the hell they want. I'm not saying it's the Pentagon. I'm just throwing a hypothetical. And then the Biden White House, they all sit in the Oval Office and they scratch their heads and go, crap, how do we get out of this now? Like you said, Zelensky might fall. We can't go into conflict with Russia. Then Ukraine's going to fall. We look stupid. We look idiotic. How do we get out of this? It took them about a week or two to figure things out. And at the end of the day, they just had to, what's the phrase? They had to bite their, bite the bullet.
Bite the bullet. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they had to bite the bullet and call Putin because they said, God, that's the last thing we want to do after we did that whole scripted, he's a killer show. But they had to bite the bullet and call him. Would that be an accurate kind of hypothetical as to what happened? The reason I bring the Pentagon into it is because we know that Austin and Harris were having a little bit of a power dispute as well. So maybe, the Pentagon feels more emboldened once again, just assumptions. But this is about
No.
the disarray of the Biden White House, not Ukraine. This is very dangerous for the world. Very dangerous for the world.
It could not be more dangerous. It is exceptionally dangerous. As I said, a United States government that doesn't know its own mind, a United States government that perhaps doesn't even have a mind, is the worst possible state of affairs that you could have. This isn't a calculated move by a US government, by a president and his team taking all the facts into consideration and making a decision about what they should do. This is a series of extraordinary responses, panicked responses, following a step taken by someone or some group of people in Washington that was clearly taken without any real understanding or top people being consulted, and without this thing being thought through. And they're doing this now again and again on issue after issue. They're doing it with China, which is perhaps even more dangerous in some ways. They're doing it in the Middle East. They're doing it with the Europeans. They're doing it with all kinds of people at all sorts of levels. And sooner or later, it's going to result in a bust-up and a crash. Now, going back to your point about narrative management, you can see the evidence both of the disarray and of the dissonance in the narrative, because the media in the US are barely touching on this story. We have a massive crisis in Ukraine. We have a huge military build-up by the Russian military there. The President of the United States telephones the President of Russia, and it's relegated to the margins. This isn't even a big story in the US or in Britain, so far as the media is concerned. And you can see why, because they're saying to each other, this just doesn't compute. How are we going to run this? How are we going to talk about this? You know, the narrative until a few days ago is Putin killer, US out to punish Russia, US out to punish Putin, cyber attack on the way. And suddenly we have this call out of nowhere, and they just don't know how to spin this or what to say, so they say as little as possible. And that's where we are, and that's the result of a government that's making things up on the hoof, which is acting reactively, where one set of people do one thing, another set of people do something else, and nobody knows exactly what's going on or where anything is going.
Boy, I would love to be sitting in the same room with Zelensky. And the reason I say that is because Zelensky must be sitting there going, holy crap, the United States just might have completely submarined my presidency, because I think the guy's in real big trouble now. And he must be saying, who the hell do I trust for orders at this point? Who should I believe when I get orders from the U.S.? I mean, he must be like, what the hell's going on there?
Well, we've discussed this already. I mean, if you want to talk to the US government, whom do you call now? Do you call Biden? Do you call Harris? Do you call Austin?
What if they call
you? Do you call Blinken? Or if they call you, exactly. What sense do you get? Just to get a sense again of the sheer dissonance. I mean, about a week ago, we were reading reports about how the US was going to send ships into the Black Sea as a show of support for Ukraine. Then we get the report from Turkey that these two ships are indeed going to pass through the straits into the Black Sea. And now we hear from the US, well, actually, those ships were never going to go to the Black Sea at all, and it was this is all Russian disinformation. I mean, Russian disinformation is incredibly useful. But I mean, all you need to do is reel back, and you see that one day they say one thing, the next day they say something completely different. And Zelensky has been put in a position where, as the British say, he's been induced to take his troops up the hill, and now he's being asked to take them down again. I mean, you cannot run foreign policy in this way, and sooner or later, something is going to go smash. I mean, it's only a question of time. It's bound to happen. In the South China Sea, in Taiwan, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, somewhere, something is going to go radically wrong.
Yeah. You know,
Now,
he doesn't have control of his administration.
No.
It's obvious. Yeah.
no,
That's all I have to say.
No,
He just doesn't have
no,
control
and
of his administration.
Well, absolutely, and I do indeed wonder whether that summit with Putin is indeed even going to happen, because, as I said, given what I think this is all about, which is, as I said, getting out of this mess in Ukraine, if they are able to get out of this mess, which, by the way, is not guaranteed. I mean, you know, it's all very well telling the Ukrainians, pull your troops back, but we know that there are many people in Ukraine who are itching for a fight and who still hope and expect the US will come to their rescue if they do. So if they do get out of this mess, well, the immediate emergency will be over. And then, as I said, it's back to the previous story, you know, Russia bad, Putin evil, Putin killer, more sanctions, punishing Russia and all that. And then we could very well find that there isn't going to be a summit at all. Because the other thing, and it's a point you made, and it's an absolutely correct point, do you really want to pitch Biden against Putin in a full summit meeting? I mean, that's going to be, I mean, Putin especially, of all people. I mean, Putin or Xi Jinping. I mean, the idea is just, I mean, it makes the stomach turn, frankly. I mean, I would have, I mean, they don't dare put him in front of American reporters who are completely sympathetic to him. Do they really want to put him up against Putin, who is a man who is always outstandingly on top of his brief? I mean, I really can't imagine it. I mean, I can't believe it's going to happen. If it does, it's going to be so carefully prepared, so carefully choreographed, and so carefully scripted that nothing of substance is going to come out of that meeting at all. But I'm not convinced. I'm not even sure it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. This is just short-term damage control. How do we minimize the damage from the fact that we just don't control our White House, and decisions are being made by other people without us knowing. That's I think that's the story here.
Absolutely. I mean, bear in mind something. I mean, what we discovered over the course of, you know, Ukraine Gate, that ludicrous first impeachment attempt of Donald Trump, is that foreign policy in the United States is often run by middle-ranking officials. I mean, the person who was running Ukraine policy in the United States in the first 3 years of the Trump administration was Colonel Vindman on the National Security Council. And when it turned out that, you know, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, had different ideas, what did Vindman do? He plotted with other people in the bureaucracy to try to remove him. I mean, it's astonishing. That shows already how dysfunctional the US government has become. But Donald Trump knew his own mind. He was a strong personality. He was able to make his own decisions. He could talk to Zelensky on the phone and make sense. He could talk to Putin on the phone and make sense. He could make decisions. He could do this, and he could put people like Vindman in their place, and indeed sack Vindman, which he eventually did. With Biden, we're not in that situation. So I mean, it's highly likely that there's all sorts of Vindmans hard at work now in the National Security Council. They've been emboldened because the Victoria Nulands have come along back. And of course, the Victoria Nulands might be the ones who are making all these decisions anyway. So without someone in full control, those people are running amok. They're running riot. And we see the disasters that they can cause.
Yeah. Buckle up, everybody. We're what, 4 months in?
Oh, it's
3 months in? Buckle up. All right, guys. I'll put a link to the Duran shop, 10% off all merch, 10% off hoodies as well. I'll put a link down below. Take care.